Hello again, everyone. It's me, Miss Joe, and I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about voting in the US. Specifically, we're going to be looking at a brief history of voting and ultimately trying to discover why voting matters. So, our objectives for today are to understand the history of voting, complete closed notes on part one, which is what we're covering today. We're going to be looking at demographics and voting behavior in the next video, so stay tuned. And then ultimately answer comprehension questions to make sure that we understand what we're talking about. So, our essential question then for today is, why does voting matter? And sometimes they have people who say to me, hey, it doesn't matter that much. I'm just one person. Tons of people out there are going to vote. Why does mine make a difference? Well, yeah, you are just one of many. But if many people vote and we increase voter turnout, perhaps we can cause more change and increase enfranchisement. That's a key term we're going to look at on our next slide. So just know that even one voice can make a difference. So here's a brief history of voting rights in the US. You probably know that our entire government structure is set up by the Constitution. You might not know, or if you knew once, forgot, that this wasn't the first go around. We actually had another government that was initially set up after the fight for independence called the Articles of Confederation. This was ultimately a failure because they were trying to protect a strong central government from crushing the people under the weight of a new monarchy. But they found out that it was really hard to make decisions or do anything really. So they had to scratch that and try again. From there, they came up with the Constitution. Now, think about that again though. Because we're concerned about a strong central government, the Constitution actually set up the states to have control over voting. So each state comes up with their own requirements and also says how voting is going to happen, whether that's at your local elections for a county or we're talking about federal elections where we're discussing President of the United States. So here's some key terms as we move forward. Suffrage. You might have heard this when we're talking about women's suffrage, but it actually just means the right to vote in general. So it can be applied to any type of voting eligibility requirement. Franchise is another term that you might have heard, although sadly, you've probably heard of it more in terms of disenfranchisement, which basically means that a person or a group of people is unable to have easy access to voting or participating in our democracy. When we're talking about electorate, that's all of the people in our country that are entitled to vote. And this is also in any given election. So again, that could be voting for your mayor or city representatives to the President of the United States. Now, we also talked last time how the electorate, even though we're talking about all of the people that are able, most people, or sadly half of the electorate, doesn't actually participate regularly in elections. That's why it's so important for you to get involved. Because if we increase the number of individuals who are participating, right, if we increase the participants in our electorate, then more people are having a say in what we're doing in our country. Right now, the current size of the electorate is more than 200 million people. That means that almost all citizens that are 18 years of age or older are actually qualified to vote. There are some exceptions, and we're going to look at those as well. But right now, I have a little challenge. Turn to your partner and see if you can name the amendments that have to do with voting in our Constitution. Dun, 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 dun. And let's see what you got. So, the 15th Amendment is super important. This is also known as one of the Civil War amendments. This is 13th, 14th, and 15th. Specifically, it gave Black Americans the right to vote and also protected future minority groups from disenfranchisement. However, I'd like to point out that there's one word here that's really important as well: Black American men and future minority groups, if they were male. This was in 1870. In fact, women didn't gain the right to vote until 1920 with the 19th Amendment. Finally, we're talking about the 24th Amendment here. You'll notice this is in 1964. This is a time period in the United States when a lot of stuff is happening, right? We're dealing with the civil rights movement, trying to overthrow Jim Crow in the South. The Vietnam War is also happening, which is related to our 26th Amendment. What ultimately ended up happening with the 24th Amendment is many southern states were making it very difficult for Black Americans to participate in any kind of elections. You've probably heard of poll taxes, or some other states would have voting tests. And even if a person got all of them right, if they decided they didn't like their handwriting, they could say, oh, you didn't pass. And so the 24th Amendment was actually signed into law and made it so that states could no longer participate in those kinds of disenfranchisement activities. So anytime a state tries to prevent voting through those kinds of hurdles, it's actually unconstitutional. And then the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. Take note of the date, 1971. This one's pretty cut and dry. Basically, all of the young people in our society said, if I'm old enough to fight and die for my country, I'm old enough to vote in my country. Again, this is during the Vietnam War era. So, what are the current eligibility requirements? These are general, and most people are aware of these, excuse me. So, you do need to be 18 years old. Some states can actually allow you to register before you turn 18. You just won't be able to vote in an election until you actually turn 18. More on that in a little bit. You must be a citizen of the United States, and you must be a resident of the state. This is important because you're not going to be able to vote in local elections, whether that be your county or your city, unless you're residing in that community. Now, if you're overseas, right, you can still vote by mail in ballot, which the US military has been participating in for years. So, what were some of the old requirements? Remember, we talked about only men could earn the right to vote? So, you used to have to be 20 years old, 21 years old, white, male, and own property. This also has to do a little bit with the framers' perspectives on the general voting populace, or we call it the electorate. I think we mentioned last time that some of the framers thought that the general populace was really too stupid to vote. And so they needed to make sure that they were putting restrictions on voting so that only the right kind of people were able to cast their opinion or their ballots, as it were. Obviously, a lot's changed. And again, the more people that are able to participate, the more that we're capturing all of the voices in our unique and diverse country. So, how are the federal government outlines different than individual states? Remember that each individual state is responsible for setting up how voting happens. In this case, I've chosen to focus on my home state of Oregon. Oregon's unique because we've actually been doing mail in ballots for almost 30 years now. And also interesting, there's been a lot of hubbub about mail in ballots, but states that have participated in mail in ballots for decades at this point, and the US military, have found that there's actually lower chances of voter fraud and it increases turnout. Some food for thought. So in Oregon, you can register to vote when you're 16 years old. So even though you're registered to vote, you can't actually vote until you turn 18. You have to be a citizen of the United States, and you have to be a resident of the state. Each state has restrictions on what their exact timeline is. This is Oregon's timeline, right? You have to be registered on the 21st calendar day before an election to be eligible to vote in that election. Also important, this differs from state to state, and we're going to look at this when we do a Socratic seminar on felon voting. So in Oregon, people in prison cannot vote, but people who are out on parole or have served their time can participate in voting. Also interesting about Oregon is this is one of the states where you are unable to participate in a primary election unless you're registered with one of the two major parties. So, what this basically means is you have to either be registered as a Democrat or a Republican in order to cast your ballot for a primary. If you're registered as an independent, essentially you're just left out of the running. This is something that the state here in Oregon, people have been trying to fight for a long time, because the idea is that it's not fair if you're not registered with one of the two major parties that you're not able to cast your vote for one of the people that's going to ultimately represent our country as a whole. So there are all kinds of hot topic issues differing from state to state. It'd be interesting to look into your individual home state to find out what's a hot topic issue there. Something else you should be aware of is what's known as the motor voter law. Try to say that 5 times fast. Motor voter, motor voter, motor voter, motor. I can't do it. So ultimately what this does is it was designed to increase access to voting. So if you're an eligible citizen, you can actually register to vote when you go to the DMV, that's French and fancy for the DMV, when you get your driver's license. If you need to renew, they'll also ask you if you need to update anything about your registration. This also makes it easier for you to register and vote by mail, and it also makes registration forms available at any local offices, so that we're trying to increase access for anyone all around the state. So here's a little quiz. Let's see what we know. In each of these scenarios, I'm going to give you a hypothetical situation. We're going to then decide if they can vote. So here we go. Scenario number 1. Megan O'Hara is 16 years old. Can she vote? Why or why not? Megan cannot vote. Now she's going into the DMV to get her driver's license. She can certainly register, but she'll have to wait till she turns 18 in order to participate. What's interesting, though, is that there are some people that argue that we should lower the voting age even still beyond 18. What are your thoughts? Here's scenario number 2. Rich Henderson is going to be out of town during Election Day. Can he vote? How? All right, let's see what you got. So, Rich Henderson can certainly vote, and being out of town shouldn't stop you from participating in your democratic privilege and right. So, there are a couple things that he can do. Even if he's not from a state like Oregon, which regularly participates in mail in ballots, in fact, everyone does it, he can request an absentee ballot, which he would then mail in. So, he can still participate. Scenario number 3. Nadia Rosinski was born in the United States. Was not born in the United States. Can she vote? How? All right, Nadia can certainly vote. She would just need to take steps in order to gain citizenship so that she can participate in our democracy through voting, right? Even though a person was not born in the United States, it doesn't mean that they're automatically disqualified. You just have to work to become a citizen of this country in order to vote. All right, so scenario number 4. Daryl Kim is a naturalized citizen. Can he vote? Why or why not? Well, if we remember Nadia from our previous scenario, yeah, Daryl Kim can vote. Even if he is not necessarily from this country, he did become a citizen, so he can vote. All right, scenario number 5. Poor Sarah Nordquist has been sleeping on the job, and she hasn't registered. Can she vote? Why or why not? Well, that all depends on where Sarah is from. So, if she was from Oregon, she would still have to make sure that she was within that registration deadline. She could still register, she might just not be able to participate in that coming election. Remember, you can update your registration at any point in time. If your address changes or if something comes up, it should be pretty easy to go on to any site within your state, or you can even do it again through the DMV to make sure that you can participate. This one might be tricksy. Scenario number 6. Henry Dobler is not registered as a Republican Party or a Democratic Party member. Can he vote in an open primary? Why or why not? All right, let's see what we got. So Henry Dobler certainly can vote in an open primary. The key word here is open primary. Remember, I told you that in my home state, we have what's known as a closed primary. So if you're not registered as a Republican or a Democratic Party member, you can't participate. Luckily, Henry Dobler's from a different state, and that's not an issue. That means anyone can participate, regardless of how they're registered or with what party. All right. Thank you for listening. Let me know what questions you have, and I'll be sure to get back to you as soon as possible. Stay tuned for part 2, voting behavior and demographics in the United States. Bye.